On May 9, 1846, one day after the Battle of Palo Alto, the American Army continued its march towards Fort Texas. The Mexican forces were waiting for them at a defensive position known as Resaca de la Palma. The location selected by General Mariano Arista provided good protection to the Mexican soldiers. Arista was confident that the Americans wouldn't be ready to attack that evening. As a result, he retired to his tent to write letters and reports. Zachary Taylor, the American commander, had a different plan. He wanted to clear the road to Fort Texas as soon as possible and pushed forward. In this episode, we will continue to cover the decisive Battle of Resaca de la Palma, part of Zachary Taylor's campaign in northeastern Mexico. Additionally, we will learn how Fort Texas was relieved from the 7-day-long siege imposed by the Mexican Army. So, get ready to witness the epic clash between two mighty armies, as we delve into the captivating story of the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. At the end of the previous episode, the Mexican forces formed a defensive line at Resaca de la Palma, about 4 miles north of Fort Texas. The American Army was further north and moving fast towards the Mexican position. Earlier that day, Captain George McCall had been sent ahead of Taylor's main force to locate the Mexican Army. When he spotted the Mexicans, McCall sent a message to Zachary Taylor. At around 3 p.m., General Taylor received Captain McCall's report. Taylor immediately ordered his troops to march towards Resaca de la Palma. The U.S. forces reached Captain McCall's position at around 4 p.m. The American commander was then briefed by McCall on the situation ahead. After a short pause, Taylor ordered the leading units of the Army of Occupation to attack, without waiting for the rest of the troops in the back. The commander of the American Light Artillery, Lieutenant Randolph Ridgely, placed his 4 cannons on a forward position on the road, about 400 yards from the Mexican line. McCall's force provided close support to Ridgely's guns. The Americans could not spot their targets easily in the thick vegetation. To entice the Mexicans to reveal their emplacements, McCall's troops moved forward. Once the Mexican cannons fired and were spotted, Ridgely's cannons fired back at them. After that, Ridgely's men pushed forward several yards, and the Americans repeated this process until they found themselves about 100 yards from the Mexican guns. Meanwhile, the American infantry regiments moved into the thicket on both sides of the road. On the east side, the 5th Infantry, accompanied by a portion of the 4th, pushed their way through the heavy brush towards the Mexicans posted in the Resaca bed. The 3rd Infantry deployed in a similar manner to the right, with the support of the remaining troops of the 4th Infantry Regiment. Any organization, however, broke down quickly in the dense thicket. The units lost contact with their comrades, and small groups of soldiers had to advance without a clear idea where the enemy was. For the Mexicans, things were not any better. The chaparral hid the advancing Americans, and many units were not even aware the battle had started until the American troops appeared among them. The Mexican cannons, directed towards the distant point where the Americans were thought to be, fired high and with little effect over the heads of the nearby foe. Arista's troops also had trouble keeping in contact with each other in the thick chaparral. The 2 companies of the Mexican 2nd Light Infantry presented firm resistance when the fighting began, but they soon fell back after suffering heavy losses. As the survivors fled for safety, the troops on the Mexican right flank became disconcerted and lost the will to hold their ground. Soon, panic spread on the Mexican right flank. At many points along the line, officers struggled strongly to keep their soldiers from running away, often to little effect. Troops of the 1st, 6th, and 10th Infantry regiments started to flee, in many cases without even firing their weapons at the enemy. When General Arista heard the battle sounds, he went outside his tent and spotted a handful of troops from the 4th Infantry rushing through the small clearing. When he asked what was going on, hundreds of men, officers, and soldiers alike poured through the clearing as they fled. troops of the U.S. 3rd Infantry found a pathway between the west end of the Resaca and the Charco de la Palma, and had unexpectedly flanked the left position of the Mexican line. Canales' troops were surprised by the sudden appearance of the Americans, panicked, and abandoned their positions. Canales later wrote, "A panic terror took over everyone, and no one wanted to be the last to reach the Rio Grande." The troops of the Mexican 4th Infantry Regiment put up more of a fight. However, when left isolated by the flight of the volunteers, they soon broke and scattered. Arista attempted to halt the torrent of frightened men, appealing to their sense of honor. Few listened, and within moments most of his infantry had disappeared. Meanwhile, in the center of the line, the Mexican artillery continued to fire back at the Americans. Taylor ordered Captain Charles May and 2 companies of dragoons to charge down the roadway and drive the Mexican cannoneers from their guns. He also sent soldiers from the 8th Infantry Regiment forward to help with the maneuver. May and his men moved ahead and informed Ridgely that they were there to charge the Mexican line. Ridgely rolled all his guns forward and fired them simultaneously. The Mexican pieces responded, each sending up a cloud of smoke exposing its location in the brush. Charles May and his men then charged. Advancing in a column 4 horses across, the dragoons galloped towards the Mexican batteries. Behind them, Ridgely limbered his guns to his horses and advanced as well. May and his men swiftly reached the Mexican guns and dispersed the artillery crews. However, the speed of the charge took May's men through the batteries and across the Resaca. When May attempted to regroup his unit on the far bank of the ravine, he could assemble only 6 men to make a second charge. In the meantime, the Mexican artillerymen regained their pieces and resumed firing. The center of the Mexican line continued to hold the Americans, even after the resistance on the left and right flanks had fallen apart. General Diaz de la Vega bravely rallied his troops to continue fighting. Other Mexican troops also stood their ground on the west side of the road. At the same time, General Pedro de Ampudia assembled remnants of other units to assist with the desperate defense. Ridgely's guns continued their advance, firing at the Mexican artillery pieces from close range. At the same time, soldiers of the 5th and 8th Infantries charged from the east and engaged the Mexicans at close quarters. McCall and May's men also joined the fight. In the dense chaparral, attackers and defenders engaged in chaotic close combat. Men on both sides fired their muskets frantically, often at targets unseen or greatly obscured by the thick vegetation. As the two armies mixed, the troops fought the enemy with their bayonets, swords and, in many cases, hand-to-hand fighting. Eventually, the U.S. forces succeeded in this struggle. Pressed in on all sides, the Mexican defenders dwindled in numbers and began to give way. The Tampico Battalion, by now reduced to a handful of men, ultimately wavered and broke. May and his dragoons attacked the last of the Mexican artillery pieces, capturing General Diaz de la Vega in the process. As this was happening, General Arista sent a messenger to General Torrejon. Arista instructed Torrejon to bring the cavalry brigade forward and join the fight. Torrejon questioned the order, expressing that charging with cavalry through the narrow road surrounded by chaparral was an unheard-of maneuver. Torrejon did not comply with the order until Arista himself rode to the scene to rally the horsemen and direct them to charge. Arista bravely led the cavalry charge down the roadway. Arista soon realized Torrejon's reluctance to join the battle. The narrow road surrounded by thick chaparral prevented a large cavalry force from moving effectively, and the lancers had great difficulty advancing with the spears in such a tight formation. By the time Arista and the Mexican horsemen arrived at the Resaca's crossing point, the Americans had captured the Mexican guns and had moved across the Resaca. Heavy gunfire from two of Ridgely's artillery pieces forced Arista and his mounted troops to retreat from the field. A short time later, Taylor's reserve units, including Croghan Kerr's dragoons, James Duncan's light artillery, and additional infantry arrived and started firing at the fleeing Mexicans. Arista's troops started a chaotic retreat towards the Rio Grande, harassed by the Americans. As dusk fell, Taylor gave the order for his men to stop pursuing the enemy and set up camp on the battlefield so they could spend the night there. Some of the units leading the pursuit continued, some made it to the Rio Grande. However, these troops were more interested in getting back in touch with the American troops at Fort Texas than fighting the fleeing Mexicans. After calm returned to the area, the U.S. troops found many trophies scattered across the battlefield. 8 artillery pieces, ammunition, stacks of guns, supplies, and, to their surprise, General Arista's tent, complete with his personal possessions. Further down the road, they found pots of food for a long-awaited meal that the Mexican soldiers were never able to consume. Nearly 500 mules with pack saddles, 20 horses, several ox-drawn carts, swords, tools, and musical instruments were also taken. Since the early hours of May 9, in a last-ditch effort to force Fort Texas capitulation, General Mejia continued shelling the American outpost. Then, around 3 p.m., the sounds of the Battle of Resaca de la Palma could be heard in the distance. This was a good indication for the men in Fort Texas that Taylor had renewed his advance. The troops knew that the battle being fought a few miles away would determine their fate. Around 5 p.m., the sound of musket fire began to move closer in their direction. Before long, they spotted large groups of Mexican troops passing by the fort, dashing for the safety of Matamoros on the other side of the Rio Grande. Mexican General Francisco Mejia only stopped firing at Fort Texas when he realized that the north shore of the river was full of fleeing soldiers from the Mexican army. An unknown number of Mexican soldiers leaped into the Rio Grande during their desperate retreat, many of them drowned trying to reach the safety of Matamoros. Before nighttime, one of Samuel Walker's Texas Rangers reached Fort Texas and delivered the news of the American victory at Resaca de la Palma. Later that evening, additional American soldiers then began to arrive, confirming the news. For the first time since the start of the siege, the Mexican guns across the river remained silent. On May 10, Taylor's army arrived en masse at Fort Texas, bringing much-needed supplies and, above all, relieving the tired men inside the fort. Total Mexican losses are unknown, but the best estimates are as follows: 154 killed, 205 wounded, and 156 missing. To these numbers, we need to add the Mexican soldiers who died attempting to cross the Rio Grande. The American Army of Occupation reported 33 soldiers killed and 89 wounded. The Battle of Resaca de la Palma resulted in a decisive victory for the United States over the Mexican forces. American troops, led by General Zachary Taylor, successfully defeated the Mexican Army of the North and forced them to retreat to the south shore of the Rio Grande. The disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande was now, without question, in American hands. Additionally, the American victory allowed General Taylor's forces to continue their advance into Mexican territory and capture the city of Matamoros, strengthening their strategic position in the region. The battle marked an escalation in the conflict between the United States and Mexico. It was one of the early engagements of the war and contributed to the intensification of military actions between the two nations. Despite the American victory, the Mexican government refused to negotiate. James K. Polk, the American president, wanted a short war. The Mexican refusal to negotiate frustrated him further. In Mexico, the defeat brought changes in the military organization. General Mariano Arista was removed from command. In his place, General Pedro de Ampudia was put in charge of the Mexican Army of the North. In the next episode, we will cover the occupation of the Mexican city of Matamoros by Zachary Taylor's army on May 18, 1846. With this, we will end this video. To make sure you don't miss our future work, please subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. Please also visit our YouTube page, where you will find additional videos about the Mexican-American War and other historical events. Thank you for your support. See you next time.